Free agency might be winding down around the NHL, but that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of interesting names and talents available, potentially at rock bottom prices. Should the Jets get involved, who might be able to find up front and on the back end? Are there any good value signings? We'll dive into all of that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, and I'm a Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is completely free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Now, like I said on tonight's episode, we've got a couple of fun things. We're going to focus on the free agent market, right? Because obviously it's been a few weeks since free agency opened, and a number of contracts were handed out, but there are some players left behind who might be worth investigating. Maybe some guys that could help out the Jets even. Let's start off with forwards, right? Obviously, this is probably where the Jets are maybe a little bit less concerned seeking additional help. But assuming that Winnipeg might want to splash out a little bit of cash for another player, Winnipeg has a couple of interesting options. Now, the most interesting name that for some reason has yet to find a new home is Tomas Tatar. And I've talked about Tatar before. Obviously, he is a really good player and somebody that I think, for me, is very underappreciated. Despite being like a solid 40-ish, maybe even 50-point player for the past several years, Tatar seemingly doesn't get that much recognition. I like him a lot as a guy who can slide up and down your lineup, and I think, quite honestly, as a middle six to top six option, he is still pretty good despite getting up there in years. He's very crafty. He has a lot of creativity and skill for a guy that, most people have kind of overlooked throughout his career. And while Tatar might be going back to the Devils, I think in a lot of ways he could potentially be the exact kind of player that would really give the Jets almost like a free rental that puts them over the edge. Now, I don't think Tatar would really want to come to Winnipeg, but assuming that the Jets could offer, a reasonable contract for a couple of seasons, maybe he thinks about it, right? 2 years, what could you get him for to come up to the Jets? But obviously, with Winnipeg's cap situation, Winnipeg would probably have to shed some salary first, and I don't know if Winnipeg is really all that keen to do so. But in terms of a guy who would give you a lot of bang for your buck, I feel like Tatar would probably be one of the better signings you could make. But it would really depend on what Tomas wants to get in free agency. Based on the fact that he's not really moving so far, it makes me wonder if, A, maybe he's asking for more than is really reasonable, or B, maybe teams are starting interested in him. I don't know why they wouldn't be. 48 points last season is certainly nothing to sniff at. So maybe it's more on the cost side of things. But if you were to come to Winnipeg at a reasonable price, I think you'd be very, very happy with that. Another guy that might be worth taking a look at is Pius Suter. Pius Suter hasn't been back in the NHL too long, but was a guy who really brought a really solid two-way game. Was never like the most prolific scorer, but as a guy who maybe on like a third or a fourth line could do a potential job. Suter is actually a pretty reasonable player. He's, been around a 25, 30-point kind of bottom six guy, somebody who would probably anchor your third line down the middle. Occasionally, I think he has played out wide, but I think predominantly, you'd want to have him be like your third line scoring center. And he's been playing, a couple of seasons in the NHL, had some time off here and there, but I feel like if he were to join the Jets, maybe even bolstering Winnipeg's third line, you'd get some pretty good value. I would look at him over somebody like Mason Appleton or something, right? As much as Appleton is a nice player to have for like an internal development aspect or angle, unfortunately, in terms of being paid like 2.2 million or so per season, hasn't really provided a ton of solid value yet. So I feel like Suter would be an interesting upgrade. He's got a really sound two-way game, and having come back, I think it would be nice to have him join the Jets and potentially be a pretty solid addition to Winnipeg's PK unit, and maybe even offer a little bit more finishing talent than the Jets have in the third and fourth lines. Now, this year's team is going to be better at scoring, so I expect the Jets to not have as many issues with the third and fourth lines, but Suter would probably still be a pretty cheap upgrade. Now, one other player that could be of interest, I doubt that he's really going to be doing much of anything right now, but if Winnipeg were to maybe pursue Danton Heinen, it might be worth taking a look at. Heinen obviously rejected the Jets last time to, go to free agency and then eventually sign with the Pittsburgh Penguins. I wouldn't be averse to seeing if Heinen would join the Jets again. Obviously, he's not crazy. Maybe a 15 to 30 point player at the very high end, and obviously at the low end, probably 15 to 20 points. But he's like a solid two-way winger, can also play down the middle. Very, solid third or fourth line player. And again, if you're looking for somebody with a little bit of finesse, a little bit of extra skill, maybe not a lot of finishing talent, but a guy who can create some chaos down low, Heinen has traditionally been pretty decent at that over his career. Obviously a very skilled guy, and certainly somebody who could, in a pinch, be asked to elevate himself further up the lineup. But I think at this point in his career, you're not really asking him to be much more than like a 25-point sort of player. And obviously, I don't even know if he would want to join the Jets. I think he will probably look to re-sign with Pittsburgh or something like that for another $1 million. But hey, if he joins the Jets, wouldn't be the worst. He had a couple of seasons where he actually did cross the 40-point mark, actually one season in particular, and then, crossed the 30-point mark a couple of times. So he's got some decent finishing talent. Whether he would actually get enough time to do that with the Jets is debatable. But you know what? As a player who could potentially join the Jets and offer Winnipeg a little bit more depth down the middle, on a cheap contract, you really couldn't be upset. So that's one option. But I also want to take a look a little bit on the back end, just because there's a lot of guys that the Jets could potentially investigate, especially if they maybe make a trade or two and want to upgrade through free agency. Not that I would do this, but it is potentially an option. We'll talk about what free agent defenders are out there and if it's even worth considering. But before we go any further, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount back in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right, just $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. Obviously, as an Orioles fan, for us, it's more about maybe betting where the O's are going to finish in the AL East. At the top, maybe. Second place, very possibly. For Jays fans, y'all are probably trying to figure out how many games back you're going to be of the AL East lead, because it's just a crazy division. And while Toronto is still a very strong team, obviously they've taken a little bit of a step back over the past season or two. But no matter what team you're rooting for, you can be sure that when you're betting MLB with FanDuel, you can do so on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And best of all, when you win, you get paid instantly. And who doesn't love a little bit of instant gratification? There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Hello, friends. Welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Jets fans, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are taking a look at some potential free agent options as the Jets are looking for some guys to maybe fill in the gaps here and there. Not a ton of players that I think are really exciting and that I, honestly want to splash a lot of cash out for, but there are a couple of guys who maybe, just maybe, are worth taking a brief look at. Now, I mostly talked about some decent forwards. On the blue line side of things, it's a little bit of a rougher story. I think if the Jets were to upgrade the defense, it'd probably have to come more through a trade than free agency. But all that said, let's talk about some of the top free agent defenders still left on the market. The first name that I think is going to jump out to people is Matt Dumba. Obviously, he hasn't renewed with the Minnesota Wild. I don't know that they're really that keen on signing him for a particularly large contract. And I think Dumba's probably going to want like a Neil Pionk sort of deal. And whether he's really worth that is certainly debatable. I think he has a lot of the same issues that Pionk does. And despite being a very capable, very skilled scorer, in terms of the defensive work and stuff, and some of the other aspects of creation that you want out of him, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag throughout his career. So Dumba, I feel like, on a more value focused contract, I really wouldn't hate, but he's going to have to try and push to get a big deal. This is probably one of his last big chances to get a major extension. So I'm going to guess that Dumba wants a long-term deal, and I don't know that I would be all that interested in something like that. Now, one guy I actually would have a lot more time for is Ethan Bear. And I know that Bear isn't maybe the sexiest name that comes to mind, but in terms of a guy who I thought would be a really solid third pairing blue liner for the Jets, somebody who's very capable of moving the puck, who's got a pretty decent shot and also can make passes, which I know is it sounds like a little bit of a silly thing to say, but honestly, we've seen the Jets struggle with passing. So somebody who can actually do that would be nice. Bear somehow ticks off all of those boxes. And, in terms of a guy who I thought would actually be a pretty nice third pairing upgrade, maybe even second pairing upgrade, if the Jets were able to bring him in and replace Pionk with him, I don't think he would actually cost that much. As much as we all love Neil and his personality and stuff, we know that in terms of the value for money that you're getting, Pionk unfortunately has struggled to live up to that, especially the past year or two. Bear, I think, if you get him for like $2 million for a few seasons, $2.5 million per, that's actually a pretty fair contract. I think he'd bring great value. I think he'd be somebody that fans would really become attached to. And, as a player who, for some reason, continues to be a little bit underappreciated, I think Bear would fit in very nicely for Winnipeg. Now, there is one other defender, I guess, that you could even consider. And look, I'm going to be honest, I don't even know if he's had much game time recently, or what his current level of play is, because obviously playing for the Sharks recently, not so great. This is Markus Nutivaara, and Marcus, when he was with Columbus, was actually a really underrated two-way defender with solid puck-moving ability, not outstanding, but solid. Very good defensive instincts, and when you looked at his shot impacts on the ice, he actually limited chances very effectively against opponents, which for the Jets would actually be a pretty useful trait. I think you'd want him ideally in more of like a third pairing role, so Nutivaara, whether he would really play that much of a role for the Jets would be pretty debatable. But I think if you're looking for maybe somebody who's a little bit more well-rounded than Kyle Capobianco, I think that would be an option. Now, would you expect a lot out of Nutivaara? No, probably not. And I think his recent stint with San Jose, last I saw, was not going super well, if I'm being honest. But maybe if he joined the Jets and came to a system that's a little more suited to his skill sets, where he's a little bit less exposed, maybe things would work out. But again, whether he'd actually want to come to Winnipeg at this point, it's debatable. I think a lot of these free agents, when you're looking at value contracts, it's a tough sell, right? Because you got to move up to Winnipeg, and obviously, may not be the most premier destination for a lot of players. But I think if you're a guy looking for a job and the alternative is not getting paid and not making money, maybe you take the hit for a couple of seasons, and who knows, maybe the Jets are actually going to be good enough to go on a bit of a playoff run. But when you look at the free agency class right now, it's just very weak, and I think that's the general impression I've gotten. This year, guys like Libor Hayek and Ethan Bear, Matt Dumba, I mean, these are some of the marquee defenders out there. Slater Kekik is still out there. I think he's actually retired or something. But generally speaking, just not a lot of top-end talent available. Even at forward, there wasn't much to really go by. So in a little bit, I'll talk about which players I think of the ones that I've mentioned might provide the most bang for your buck, and, players that I think the Jets could reasonably afford. Maybe even one or two additional names that might be worth considering, especially since Winnipeg might have to get a little bit creative if they're going to work around, the rapidly vanishing cap space, especially with a couple of RFAs still to go. We'll dive into all of that in just a moment. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks, folks, for joining us on tonight's episode. We're just wrapping up really quickly with some thoughts on potential free agency bargain bin sort of purchases. And I'm going to be honest, I'll say some of these guys are probably not going to be big difference makers. We've talked about a couple of them that I thought are reasonably decent. Tomas Tatar, I think, would probably, for me, be the marquee name, right? Tatar is a legitimate middle six to top six option. I think he really shone with the Devils and was very good. He almost had 50 points. And as a player who could really fortify Winnipeg's depth and make this team legitimately scary up front, I think he would be an awesome signing. But he's probably going to want like $4.5 million or something for a couple of years. And that's probably a little more than the Jets can really afford. So, considering what your options are, just going to somebody internally, I think Winnipeg might opt for that option. If the Jets are really being budget conscious, I would actually say, for me, Pius Suter would be the way to go. I think he's really undervalued. He had really solid on-ice numbers and box scores for the Red Wings last season. And sure, he's bounced around, between the U.S. and abroad recently. But I think overall, every time he's played in North America, he's been really good and really underappreciated. He's got really solid scoring instincts, a solid two-way game. He just seemingly does a lot of the details well, and I think for a really cheap signing that could potentially give Winnipeg like an elite bottom six, you really couldn't go wrong if you offered him a contract. Don't go like hog wild, but not that, maybe $2 million or something for a season. I really think that would be pretty cool for the Jets. Another guy that I thought, again, I've mentioned, for the blue line, obviously not a ton of great signings, but a guy who I think is really going to provide a lot of value for whoever gets him for cheap is Ethan Bear. Bear, like I was just talking about, I feel like brings a lot of puck moving ability. He's got, smart offensive instincts, and he's not terribly, he's not terrible on the defensive side of things either. Maybe his positioning could use a little work. Maybe he's not the most physical of blue liners, but in terms of a guy who's really solid at, most things, if you're looking for like a number 4 or a number 5D on a budget, I think Bear would very much satisfy that, maybe even exceed that value by a decent bit if you get him in the right situation. I certainly wouldn't mind seeing if he could even help quarterback the power play for the Jets, because obviously Winnipeg's blue line unit has mostly just been Morrissey and then whoever else can anchor that back end for the power play, but almost no one else is really capable of it on this unit. So would be nice to get an upgrade there, and also just a nice upgrade for the second pairing, because as it is right now, Winnipeg's defense is slow and really struggles with breakouts. So maybe Bear could help with that. I don't know. Wouldn't be worth or wouldn't be the worst idea if you want to just toss out a contract and see if he'd come to the Jets. Now, one final name that is a little bit controversial, just because I think he's never really lived up to what he was billed to be, but a guy that I wouldn't be averse to potentially seeing if he would come in on like a PTO is Jesse Puljujärvi. And obviously, I've talked about him before. A lot of people are like, oh, he's soft and not interesting and he sucks. And it's not entirely false, right? Some of the narratives about him are definitely untrue, but there's a couple of criticisms that I think are legitimate. And one of the big ones with him is that he just doesn't score. For one reason or another, Puljujärvi is always really good at getting into position, but like when it comes to actually scoring in front of goal, that's where things have kind of died. And for me, Puljujärvi, whenever I've watched him, is such a dynamic force in possession, and he creates all the space. He does all of the hard work. He drives towards the net, and then there's just not really much of an end product. And so I think that's what's really held him back and probably dinged his confidence. It's kind of like Morgan Barron of this past season, where Barron would do all of the hard work, get into the really dangerous areas, and then have it saved almost immediately. Puljujärvi, I still think if you give him the right role and ask him to be kind of a creative energy force on your third or your fourth line, would actually be really good at that. I think he would, out-muscle defenders, blow by them with that really good skating that he has. And while he might not really generate a lot of scoring on the sheet, I think he'll help you create chances. And for the Jets, there are other more talented finishers on this team who could probably do that job and honestly punch the puck in for him. But, Puljujarvi is still very skilled. I think he still has a potential ability to become a full-time NHLer, even if, the Oilers might not have agreed or even the Canes might not have agreed. You look at those teams, and obviously it'd be hard for him to crack that roster. But for the Jets, maybe he'd actually make the third or fourth line, or even as a guy who could potentially fight for injury reserves, right? So Puljujarvi would be pretty cheap, but he maybe wants to go home. It's been a rough time in North America. Maybe moving back to Liga would be best for him so he can go back and be with some family. Very happy-go-lucky kid, and it's a shame that it never really worked out for him with the Oilers. But let me know what other budget signings you're thinking about. Maybe you have a free agent in mind that you're excited about. Drop their names in the comments below and what you think the Jets should do with the remaining cap space that they've got in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We will see you back here tomorrow with more off-season coverage, so don't go anywhere. Have a great night, and go Jets go.